Hold on. The smiley face, frightened and scared. Now, we went through a tremendous amount. Actually, 5 hours? No, 4 hours? I'm doing that again. How much have I talked so far? Like 5 hours. Jeez Louise. Okay. Now, we went through a lot of foundational material, probably about 5 hours of material, talking about what are the differences between male and female? What are the cognitive differences? How much power does a woman have in society today? How do things work in a hunter-gatherer society? How do they work in a farming society? A lot of information, hopefully a lot of information that blew your mind a little tiny bit, or at least made you look at the world around you with new eyes, and to not take everything in your society as just given, that it's a construct and it's there for a reason. So now what I want to do is start to jump into the ancient world. And I want to start with Mesopotamia, the land between the two rivers, the Tigris and Euphrates, and the Levant, Syria, Palestine, where Israel and Palestine are today. And I want to focus in on some of the oldest complex civilization on the planet, number one. And number two, I want to focus in on the agricultural social system within a city-state. All of these different regions and societies that we're going to be looking at in this class, Women in Power in the Ancient World, categorize themselves or organize themselves into different social government systems. And the social or government system will help to define how much power a woman might have within that society. The city-state, we'll find, is not always so great for female power. Female power might work better in a regional state, like in Egypt. These things are up for discussion, and we can look at all of them. But let's start with some of the oldest complex society, and let's look at the city-state first. Now, before I get there, I want to quickly go over some terms that will be important as we move through this region of the world and this topic in the class, the Levant and Mesopotamia. The first one we've already talked about, and the word has already been mentioned multiple times, and that word is patriarchy, rule by the fathers. This is, hopefully by this point in the class, not something that seems foreign to you or strange, but essentially it's a male authority figure of the family. It could be an extended family that has aunts and uncles and grandparents. It could be a nuclear family that's just the mother, father, and the children. But the father figure has the control of that social group. And that male authority, the male authority in a patriarchy, extends to the government, extends to other parts of social organization, and really extends to every part of Michael Mann's rubric. If you think back to what is power, how do we organize it, how do we think about it? The patriarchy extends to, let me say that sentence again. Patriarchy extends to ideological systems, economic systems, who has control of the money, military systems, who gets to fight the battles and lead the battles, and political systems, who gets to walk the halls of power, make the laws, and tell people what to do. Patriarchy is inserting itself into all of those systems, controlling all of those systems. And that patriarchy, as we've just discussed in the last section, controls female sexuality, controls her procreation, controls her partnerships, the legality, the economic nature thereof, all of those things. And the female is subordinated within this system. Female is generally not allowed to have a trade or a profession or a job of any kind. Her job is to produce children for her male counterpart who has the job or the profession and the entree into society. Now, the other key point, and that's where we talked about this last time, last section. Let me say this again. One of the key factors of this city-state in Mesopotamia or Levant, or indeed any of the regions that have an agricultural society that we'll be looking at in this class, is the link between private property and female oppression. And patriarchy and private property really go hand in hand. The farm is going to be owned by the patriarch or rented by the patriarch, passed down through the patriarchal line. That farming needs labor, and the labor, the production thereof, needs the control of the female, the maximization of her biological production of children, of her womb. Children are now seen as economic assets. almost in the same way as you would think of your livestock as economic assets. And your wife now needs to be the producer of those economic assets. You need a fertile wife to have a fertile farm and to be able to hand down a great deal of wealth to your children in your patriarchal system. We've already talked about women's reproduction is intensified and controlled. They're often controlled as private property themselves. So she's often bought and sold, maybe with the bride price, or she comes with economic value. That all goes together with the patriarchy, with the private property. The exploitation of land and livestock, again, is inextricably linked to the exploitation and control of the woman. So we have all of that understood, but now let me translate those things into Mesopotamia and the Levant. Actually, that's a horrible segue because it makes it seem like prostitution only happens in the Mesopotamia or the Levant, which is so not true. You can cut that if you like, as you like. But one thing that is very interesting, very recent in human history that comes along with patriarchy, agricultural societies, complex society is prostitution, the invention of prostitution, and the invention of sexual morality. These ideas may have popped into your brain as I was talking in the last section about the new control of human sexuality, particularly control of female sexuality. And you may have thought, well, it's interesting, if we have social inequality and we have control of sexuality in a way we've never had before, I bet we're going to get prostitution. And you would be right. And prostitution would also be something that is wholly unfamiliar to the hunter-gatherer. An idea of taking wealth, which is a little difficult if you're not able to hoard any kind of wealth or store grain or do any of those things as a hunter-gatherer, a little hard, but to take wealth and to trade it for sexual favors, very strange. Why would you do that? There's sex available all the time in my tribe or community, the hunter-gatherer may think. And you may think back to your Jared Diamond reading where what people like to talk about and fantasize about in a given hunter-gatherer community is food. That's what's scarce. People don't talk about sex all the time. We talk about sex all the time because for us, sex is still very, very scarce, despite the explosion of pornography and what seems to be sexual freedoms exploding. We still keep a very close moral lock on sexuality, and thus that's where our fantasies go in society. But this idea of prostitution, very, very strange for a hunter-gatherer. And think of it in terms of the society that we're now talking about. This is going to be an institution that will only be available to the men who can afford it, to the men who are more at the top of society rather than the bottom, or potentially to the men who don't have a household of their own and don't need to protect a family with wealth. Men like a military or a sailor or something like that. And we can also imagine for those men who can't afford prostitution but are still put into the boundaries of societal expectations and moral rules, they might just take sex where they think they can, and thus the idea of rape could be. I'm not trying to say that primates don't rape, and I'm not saying there's no rape in a hunter-gatherer society, but I am saying that if you lock sex down and control it for men and for women, and then you create this institution called prostitution that's only available to men who have the money, there's still going to be sexual frustration amongst many people in your society by the male members of your society who may decide in increasing numbers to take that sex from the more vulnerable members of society as they see fit, or even to exploit and, as I'm thinking, Colin, you can cut as you like here, but or even to exploit members of their own household and their own family to get the sex that they can't get from their partner or that they can't get outside. One could even argue that the idea of child abuse, sexual child abuse within the family, is something that goes along with the farming community, that goes along with the strict social controls of sexuality, the strict expectations of sexuality, and the removals of the sexual freedom amongst a group. That could very well be the kind of thing that encourages sexual abuse within the home and sexual abuse of one's own family members or even one's own children in the home. another little tangent, but I think it's important for us to question everything. Don't assume that these things have been around forever. Many of these things that we accept in our society and think of as normal are very new and recent developments. And I just want you to be looking around the world all around you and trying to think how your sexuality, how human sexuality and behaviors have changed over the last 10,000 years and as certain societal structures develop and fall away. Now, if prostitution is developed at the same time as patriarchy and private land ownership and city-state living or regional state living with governments and all of this stuff that goes along with complex society, then sexual morality is also invented. And I've touched on this before, the idea that a hunter-gatherer doesn't have his or her sexual freedom limited or even commented upon or impinged in any way by morality. Yes, there are taboos about when you can have sex and with whom you can have sex. Incest is going to be frowned upon within a hunter-gatherer community. Having sex too soon after pregnancy is going to be frowned upon in a hunter-gatherer community. There are social reasons for doing that. There are biological reasons for frowning upon incest. And most mammalian species have some sort of a taboo on incest just for the health of the species. But this idea of sex being good or bad within certain legal and economic confines is wholly new. It is invented. And this idea of sex being good or bad according to the scripture that you're reading, whether it's Judeo-Christian, Islamic, Mormon, whether it's Hindu, whether it's Buddhist, these things are new inventions of an agricultural society that is very much trying to keep human beings within expected legal and economic circles of control. And so if you want, you can pick up the Bible that you happen to have nearby. If there isn't one nearby, get online and Google Leviticus, Google Deuteronomy, Google those parts of the Old Testament that talk about sexual strictures and how a man is supposed to behave and how a woman is supposed to behave. And I think you'll say, oh yeah, of course, you're not supposed to be homosexual. That's wrong. That's a new thing. That's a new invention of morality. It's now there in a scripture of the Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible, telling you that God says, or this law says in the Old Testament that this is something that is wrong. I want you to think, well, what would a hunter-gatherer say? If a hunter-gatherer were born and he liked having sexual relations with other men in his tribe, that would be allowed. There wouldn't be any problems for that because he's now not, the hunter-gatherer is not confined into a social situation where he has to create progeny to pass down his material wealth in a patriarchal context to compete with his neighbors in a very competitive agricultural system. Homosexuality is a game changer, very problematic in this highly controlled sexual landscape of the agricultural community. In the same way that female sexual freedom is a game changer, a destabilizer in this agricultural system. And so it should come as no surprise that you now see in those scriptures and those moral rules that you may find in any religion, the control of sexuality that is aberrant to the patriarchal system that maintains agricultural norms and values. Start thinking about it in those terms, and I think you'll be surprised at what you see. And getting back to these ideas that we discussed in the first part of the class, nature versus nurture, which is more powerful, I think it's extraordinarily interesting that our biology may seem to us as the game changer, the thing that just puts us on a certain path and determines how we behave in society, when really, hopefully, you're getting from what I'm telling you that it's the societal rules that we create. It's the nurture that can change even your most base impulses of sexuality, even your most base impulse of wanting to be homosexual versus straight. You may feel that you have to fit yourself into certain social expectations because of these new rules and mores, and that's nurture winning over nature. And as we move through this class, I hope you'll see that biology can be easily transcended if the social systems demand it. A gay man or woman can easily pretend to not be gay if they feel they might be harmed or killed or maligned or ostracized by their traditional society. A woman who has an interest in having an affair with her next door neighbor in a traditional village society might subsume those feelings and not act upon them because she knows that the outcome of acting upon those feelings could be so devastating to her. And in both cases, there's this notion of morality. What does God tell you to do? What is the right and good thing to do? All of these things are human inventions from the last 10 to 5 to 3,000 years. We take them as given. We take it as a normal thing that women who are loose in their sexuality are whores or sluts, when that is an invention that is quite recent in the human lifespan as a primate mammal being. Another new invention, and this one does go very closely hand in hand with Levantine and Mesopotamian societies, and that's the harem. So if you're going to invent a system of prostitution and you're going to invent all kinds of institutionalized ideologies of morality, why would you not also invent an institution that allows the most important man in your society to have as many children as he needs to have, to maximize his physical production of babies, to make sure that he has as many options for the next king in his patriarchal line as possible. And so we use this word harem. It's unfair. It's an orientalizing way of referring to this institution because harem simply means woman in Arabic. And why should you use this word woman and then assign it to this very, very extraordinarily unequal social system that gives many women to a man? But in Turkish, this idea of the harem, let me start that part again. But for the Ottoman emperors, this idea of the harem became very institutionalized, and we use their word for this idea of one man, very, very important man, having many wives, hundreds of wives, maybe even thousands of wives. And I'm going to use the word harem in that context, even with the Orientalist caveat attached to that. So please keep that in mind. In a harem society, the sexuality, the movements, the dress of hundreds of women are controlled and contained in one palace or multiple palace structures and are only made available to one man. The women may have to dress in a certain way, behave in a certain way. There's a strict hierarchy in most harem societies, whether they be in China or Ottoman Turkey or ancient Egypt. Women know where they fall in the pecking order. There's very important wives who make all kinds of decisions on behalf of other wives. There's matriarchal figures who are past reproductive age, but who may help to rule the harem, maybe even the emperor or king's mother himself. But this one man, this important man, the emperor, the king, can enter this space as like a sexual paradise, if you will, and can do whatever he likes. Think of the social power connected to that, given all that I've just told you, that we're in an agricultural system now where sex is locked down and controlled for males and for females in these economic, legal, monogamous situations, and that breaking out of it is adultery, it's wrong, it's punishable by death in some societies. Very, very problematic. But at the same time in such a society, you might give one man the power to have hundreds, if not thousands of women, beautiful, young women, gorgeous, to dance for him, to be naked for him, to take their veils off, to do whatever they need to pleasure him and to maximize his output of physical progeny, of offspring. That's a pretty big reward. It might create all kinds of competition amongst other men who are also trying to get that position of emperor king. It might create more regicides, murder of the king, right? Because people might be trying to move into that situation themselves and get that big reward. It's debatable. It'd be an interesting research topic to see if harem societies increase level of regicide. But it is a high reward that is reserved for those few men at the very, very top of society that ensures his dynastic succession. And it is so controlled that most harem societies are protected by other women or by men who've had their sexuality taken away. So if you look at the harem societies that occur in China or in Ottoman Turkey, Anatolia, you see that eunuchs staff these harems. These are men who, at a young age, have had their testicles removed, have been gelded, so to speak, and thus have no ability to have any sort of sexual ability or progeny of their own. And these emasculated men, they're allowed to be amongst the women. It's kind of a manufactured third gender. Again, not something that hunter-gatherers would know or be familiar with. Very strange to create a man who has no sexual threat to you, and that man is then allowed to be in the harem. It's an amazing thing when people move into agricultural societies that they start to treat other human beings like the livestock that are a part of those agricultural societies. That human livestock or human capital can be male or female, and it can be a woman who is it can be a woman who's been mutilated in terms of her genitals, or it can be a man who's been mutilated in his genitals. And you are manufacturing and controlling human beings like you would livestock, to geld them in a sense. And that's something that goes together with the agricultural community and is a very new thing. There are still traditional societies on this planet that geld men. But it's not in the numbers that we see for female circumcision, which really has a life of its own and continues to be maintained amongst human societies as much as we may abhor it. Now, okay, so let me do a hard out so that you have something if you want to make that a separate section.
Cool.
Do you hear that? That's horrible.
The people?
No, my stomach.
Oh, okay.
You didn't hear that? Okay, good. So these things that I've just discussed, the invention of morality, prostitution, harem societies, are all part of the patriarchy, all part of land ownership. Just about every society that we're going to look at has them, but I wanted to introduce them before we talk about Mesopotamia and the Levant because they really do key into the social systems that we see there. Okay.